Kara Shalom, welcome to our watercolor journey. Today we are going to look at light and shadow as well as different brush strokes. The materials used are listed in the description below. On the palette we have Ultramarine Finest, Cerulean, Raw Sienna, Burnt Sienna, a grey-brown premix of Ultramarine Finest and Burnt Sienna, Quinacridone Red, Imidazalone Lemon Yellow, an orange premix of Quinacridone Red and Lemon Yellow, and a green premix of Ultramarine Finest and Lemon Yellow. Color alternatives are listed below. The Fabriano paper is taped to a flatboard and Heinrich uses the Princeton 1-inch mop to wet the entire paper. He uses the Vinci Sceptre Gold II Round to start with the sky. First up is Ultramarine Finest. He starts with loose streaks at the top of the picture plane and then adds a touch of Cerulean to bring variation in the blue of the sky. He leaves some white spaces for the clouds. He adds some of the grey-brown premix just underneath and loosely around the white spaces to serve as shadows and emphasize the cloud shapes. Because the dark color mixes with some more blue on the paper, it becomes a beautiful soft grey. The loose sideways strokes give the sky a windswept look. Here he adds some of the orange to create the sunset. He then adds some Quinacridone red and blends the colors gently on the paper. The paper is very wet and the colors blend to form soft edges. Although the Quin red looks very much in your face, it will diffuse a lot in the moisture on the paper. And also keep in mind that watercolors become much fainter when dry. So don't be afraid. Be bold and use enough pigment to make a statement. He extends the sky a bit so that it falls just beneath the center line of the picture plane. If you only work up to the center line, your painting will look like it is split in half. Always keep the rule of thirds in mind. Heinrich cleans the brush and then adds raw sienna as the first layer of the foreground. In contrast to the patchy streaks in the sky, he uses broad sweeps of the brush here. This will lay down a more even wash, which he can add to later. He adds a bit of water to help the paint spread. He adds touches of burnt sienna to bring variation in the first wash. To contour the terrain, he adds some grey-brown in sweeping strokes. These are sometimes horizontal and sometimes with a slight diagonal angle. This makes the terrain much more interesting than if it was simply a flat piece of land. He mixes some more of the dark grey-brown and adds another layer to the foreground. Now the brush strokes are shorter and more prominent. This brings some variation to the terrain and will create natural shadows in the foreground. Here he mixes a bit of Lemon Yellow with Ultramarine Finest to create a cool green. If you add more ultramarine, the color will be cooler and more blue-green. Adding more of the Lemon yellow will give you a brighter, warmer green. He uses the green to add a tree line to the middle ground. He adds a bit of blue to make it cooler in some places, which helps to create dimension. Heinrich will use the Rosemary and Company Sable blend brushes to paint the foreground. Adding the same green into the wet grey-brown of the foreground makes it much darker. He adds some Lemon yellow to bring in a bit of light. He uses the same brush with the paint that he picked up from the foreground here to add shadows to the trees in the background. This ties the two areas together and creates harmony. He extends the tree line towards the middle by blending the green into the sky area. This makes it lighter and softer and helps to create depth. Notice also that the line becomes thinner into the distance. Heinrich uses some of the darker mix to add some more shadows to the tree line. He picks up some of the excess paint at the bottom of the painting and adds that to the tree line as well. Adding all these different colors adds beautiful dimension and variation to the distant tree line. He adds a bit more shadow, but because the paper is still wet, the paint spreads a bit too much while he's working on the right hand side of the picture. He will dab out the excess with a paper towel a bit later on. On the right, he adds the same greens and yellow, but he also adds a bit of burnt sienna for warmth. This will bring these bushes slightly forward. Even though he adds burnt sienna to the left as well, you can see a distinct difference in the dispersion of the paint. The paper is slightly drier on the right, so the paint does not spread as much. On the left, the paper is wetter, so the burnt sienna diffuses more and only gives a bit of variation in the color, not a distinct color difference as in the tree line on the right. Here Heinrich dabs out the excess paint and allows the painting to dry. To add a bit of interest to the landscape, he will add some buildings and other man-made objects. He starts with the roof of the house and he uses burnt sienna. He adds a touch of the darker mix to make the roof look more natural. The house isn't perfect, it's merely lines and dots that suggest the outline of the house and the windows. He adds a touch of green in front of the house to ground it. The greens around the house has more lemon yellow, which makes it a bit warmer. This brings the area slightly forward from the rest of the tree line. He mixes a tiny bit of Quin red with Cerulean to create a purple, which he will use as the first layer of the shadow side of the house. He adds another building to the left of the house. This one is a bit skew and less distinct to emphasize the idea of neglect and abandonment. He frames this building with some bushes. Here he uses the green mix and the belly of the brush to add a clump of trees behind the buildings. He uses lemon yellow to add light to the trees and the dark mix to add shadows. The trees are far in the distance, so there isn't a lot of detail. The light is coming from the right, so he adds more shadows to the left of the clump of trees. He made more of the dark mix and uses this to add defining shadows to the buildings. He uses the dark mix with a bit more burnt sienna to give a browner color to add some definition to the trees. Now he starts to define the foreground a bit more by adding some shadows. He mixes a touch of cerulean with lemon yellow to make a bright green, which he uses for the grass field in the foreground. He adds this with broad sweeping strokes and then adds water to help the paint spread. He plays around between the ultramarine green mix and the cerulean green mix to bring variation in the colors of the grass field. He defines the tree line on the left very slightly by adding a few trunks. He dabs out excess paint to make the trunks less prominent. He adds some shadows around the buildings and in the foreground to help define the terrain a bit more. Here he uses ultramarine to add some lines and dots to resemble abandoned pieces of farm equipment and other discarded items. There's nothing definitive here, simply suggestions of things lying in a heap next to the buildings. He draws in a few lines to create an overgrown path. To help create depth, he adds a signpost on the right. The sign is taller than the houses, so it immediately creates distance. He adds a shadow to ground the pole. The long, thin shadow is also indicative of the time of day. It is not far from sunset. The higher the light source is in your painting, the shorter the shadows. Close to sunrise or sunset will give you longer, thinner shadows. Heinrich uses the Princeton Aqua Elite No. 1 rigger to add a defining shadow to the pole and to add tall grasses to the immediate foreground. This brush has quite a lot of spring and makes a needle-thin point, so it is ideal for painting grass stalks. He starts on the tape and then flicks the brush upward in an arc towards the middle of the page. The shape of the stalks also helps to draw the viewer's eye towards the buildings, which are the focus point of the painting. To bring variety, he varies the length, density, and shade of the stalks. He uses the tip of the brush to add a few seeds to the tips of the stalks. He decides to make the signpost a bit more prominent, so he adds some darker color to it. To tie the sky and the foreground, he uses Quin red to add a few strokes of red that will resemble some poppies growing in the field. To bring back a bit of sparkle and light into the painting, he uses white gouache. The addition of shadows and light can bring your painting to life, so don't be afraid to experiment. Always keep the source of light in mind though, as that will determine the direction and length of your shadows. Thank you so much for joining us today. Would you please be so kind and press like and comment on this video. Also, please subscribe if you haven't already. It would help us a lot. Thank you for watching. We hope to see you soon. Vaya con Dios.